In the shadow of medieval cathedrals and craft guilds, a movement was born that was destined to change the course of European history. Freemasonry, which emerged in England at the turn of the 17th and 18th centuries, crossed the English Channel and took root in France in 1725. The first official lodge opened in the Parisian tavern Silver Tower on Rue de Bussy, laying the foundation for an invisible network that soon enveloped the entire country. These gatherings, held behind closed doors by candlelight, attracted representatives of the aristocracy and the enlightened bourgeoisie. Here, in an atmosphere of secrecy and fraternal equality, a titled duke sat next to a talented artist, and a priest conversed with a philosopher. Masonic lodges became islands of free thinking in the ocean of absolutist France. Their rituals, borrowed from cathedral builders, acquired a new, symbolic meaning. The compass and square transformed from stonemasons' tools into symbols of moral improvement, and the ideals of brotherhood, equality, and the search for truth imperceptibly undermined the foundations of the old order. While the first Masonic lodges in France served as a refuge for aristocrats and intellectuals, the true revolutionary power of Freemasonry was revealed during the Enlightenment. Masonic temples became genuine laboratories of new thought, where ideas circulated freely, unconstrained by censorship and the prejudices of the old regime. Here, behind closed doors, protected by secrecy and fraternal oaths, a new vision of society was formed. The 18th century in France was a time of intellectual ferment. Philosophers questioned age-old traditions, and Masonic lodges provided an ideal space for the development of these ideas. By the 1740s, Paris already had dozens of active lodges, and by the beginning of the Revolution, their number across France had exceeded 2,000. Freemasonry had spread throughout the country, from Marseille to Nantes, from Strasbourg to Bordeaux. Within these secret societies, an astonishing social alchemy was born. Inside the lodge, a nobleman would address a simple lawyer as brother, forgetting about class distinctions. A merchant could freely debate with a duke, and a priest with an atheist scholar. The Masonic ritual began with a symbolic shedding of all external regalia and titles. A person entered the lodge neither naked nor clothed, leaving all metal objects, symbols of wealth and status, at the threshold. This practice of equality within the lodge walls gradually transformed into a political ideal. The principles of brotherhood proclaimed by Masons evolved into a dream of universal human fraternity. The freedom of thought cultivated in the lodges became a demand for political freedom, and the equality of brotherhood members turned into a call for the equality of all citizens before the law. It is significant that the famous slogan of the French Revolution, "Liberty, equality, fraternity," almost literally echoed Masonic values. This motto, carved on the pediments of public buildings and printed on revolutionary flags, had deep roots in Masonic philosophy. The works of Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu were actively discussed in the lodges. Many of these philosophers were Masons themselves. Voltaire was initiated into the Lodge of the Nine Sisters a few months before his death. Benjamin Franklin, another famous Mason whose ideas about republican governance found grateful listeners among the French brothers, was present at the ceremony. Masonic lodges became a school of civil society. Here, elections of officials were practiced, votes were taken on important issues, and constitutions and statutes were drawn up. Each lodge represented a miniature republic, functioning according to its own laws in the heart of an absolutist monarchy. Masons learned self-governance and democratic procedures long before these principles were applied on a state scale. The system of Masonic degrees played a special role in the spread of revolutionary ideas. Progressing from apprentice to master and then to higher degrees, a Mason gradually discovered deeper and deeper philosophical truths. This path of self-improvement implied liberation from prejudices and dogmas, a critical reevaluation of traditional values. Who were they, these people in Masonic aprons, preparing the ground for the greatest political cataclysm of the 18th century? On the eve of the Revolution, French Freemasonry represented an astonishing social cross-section of society, where the traditions of aristocratic brotherhood clashed with the growing influence of the Third Estate. By the 1780s, there were over 60,000 Masons in France, united in approximately 700 lodges. Initially, Masonic societies were formed around an aristocratic core. The Dukes of Orléans, Montmorency, Noailles, La Rochefoucauld constituted the crème de la crème of French Freemasonry. The Grand Master of the Grand Orient of France from 1771 was none other than the Duke of Orléans himself, cousin to King Louis XVI. However, by the end of the century, the social composition of the lodges had significantly changed. If, in the 1750s, nobles made up about 40% of French Masons, by 1789 their share had decreased to 25%. Their place was taken by representatives of the Third Estate, lawyers, doctors, merchants, bankers, artists, writers. It is noteworthy that Freemasonry attracted the most educated and progressive part of French society. The vast majority of brothers had a good education, spoke several languages, and were familiar with the philosophical works of the Enlightenment. Many Masons were subscribers to Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, the main intellectual project of the era. In provincial cities, Masonic lodges became centers of local intellectual life. In Bordeaux, Lyon, Marseille, Toulouse, Masons were often simultaneously members of literary academies, scientific societies, and musical salons. These people formed a new elite, based not on birth privileges, but on personal achievements, education, and talent. Particularly noticeable was the influx of representatives of legal professions into the lodges. Parliament lawyers, notaries, and judicial officials constituted a significant part of the Masonic Brotherhood. It was these people, professionally connected with law and law-making, who later played a key role in the formation of new political institutions in revolutionary France. For example, Jean-Jacques Duval de Prémenil, a councillor of the Parliament of Paris and a prominent Mason, became one of the leaders of the parliamentary opposition to absolutism in 1788. Maximilien Robespierre, a provincial lawyer from Arras, was also a member of a Masonic lodge before the Revolution. An important feature of French Freemasonry was the growing divide between aristocratic and bourgeois lodges. In Paris, there were elite aristocratic lodges, such as the Olympic Circle or the Society of Harmony, where access for representatives of the Third Estate was virtually closed. At the same time, lodges with a predominance of the bourgeoisie were forming, for example, the famous Nine Sisters Lodge, which united the intellectual elite of Paris. The Nine Sisters Lodge, named after the Muses, became a true incubator of revolutionary ideas. Among its members were the philosopher Condorcet, the astronomer Lalande, the poet Florian, and the sculptor Houdon. It was here in 1778 that Voltaire was initiated into Freemasonry, and the American ambassador Benjamin Franklin was its honorary member and master. It was in this lodge that the idea of French aid to the American Revolution, the first successful revolution against monarchy, originated. It is remarkable that an entire generation of future revolutionaries formed within Masonic lodges. Emmanuel Joseph Sieyès, author of the famous pamphlet What is the Third Estate, was a Mason. Honoré Mirabeau, one of the most brilliant orators of the Revolution, belonged to several Masonic lodges. Georges Danton, future Minister of Justice in the revolutionary government, was initiated into the lodge Perfect Equality in Paris. The social composition of Freemasonry reflected the profound processes occurring in French society. The Third Estate, especially its educated part, sought greater political influence commensurate with its growing economic role. Masonic lodges offered bourgeois representatives the opportunity to feel equal to aristocrats, to acquire skills in public speaking, participation in debates, and voting, all of which they would soon need in the political arena. In the year 1773, an event occurred that changed the course of French Freemasonry. Scattered lodges, operating throughout the country, united under the aegis of a single national organization, the Grand Orient of France. This was a turning point, when the secret brotherhood transformed into a centralized structure with a single leadership, charter, and system of subordination. The Grand Orient was housed in a luxurious mansion on Rue Cadet in Paris. The building, known as the Masonic Temple, became a symbol of the Brotherhood's growing influence. Within its walls, not only ritual meetings took place, but also philosophical debates, musical evenings, and scientific demonstrations. In fact, it was the first independent cultural center in France, unconnected to either the royal court or the church. At the head of the new organization stood Louis-Philippe Joseph d'Orléans, Duke of Chartres, later known as Philippe Égalité, the king's cousin. One of the wealthiest men in France, he gave the Masonic movement political weight and public significance. Under his leadership, the Grand Orient began to transform from a purely philosophical brotherhood into an organization with political ambitions. The centralization of Freemasonry had far-reaching consequences. A unified system of communication between lodges was created, circulars were regularly sent out, and Masonic bulletins were published. A nationwide network was formed, connecting educated and influential people from Paris to the most remote provinces. This network subsequently played a key role in the dissemination of revolutionary ideas. An important innovation was the system of lodge representation in the central governing body. Each lodge sent its delegates to the annual conventions of the Grand Orient. There, they discussed general issues, passed resolutions, and elected officials. In essence, it was a model of a parliamentary system operating under an absolute monarchy. By the 1780s, the features of future political clubs of the revolutionary era were becoming increasingly apparent in the work of the Grand Orient. Masons discussed not only philosophical and moral issues, but also pressing problems of state structure, taxation, and the judicial system. The minutes of meetings from that period show how concepts such as civil rights, constitution, and popular sovereignty gradually entered the lexicon of the Brethren. The politicization became particularly noticeable after 1785, when France faced a serious financial crisis. Masonic lodges became platforms for discussing economic reforms and criticizing government policy. Many high-ranking officials, being Masons, brought insider information about the state of affairs into the lodges, which then spread throughout the country. The structure of the Grand Orient of France became the prototype for future revolutionary organizations. The Jacobin Club, which emerged in the first months of the Revolution, largely copied the organizational model of Freemasonry. A system of mother and daughter societies, regular meetings with a chairman and secretary, a voting procedure, and membership fees. Even the seating arrangement in the Jacobin Assembly Hall resembled the traditional layout of a Masonic lodge. It is not surprising that many revolutionary leaders gained experience in public activity precisely in Masonic lodges. There they learned the art of oratory, mastered parliamentary procedures, and formed networks of personal connections. Freemasonry gave them organizational experience and a model of an alternative social order based on electivity, equality, and fraternity. When we speak of the leaders of the French Revolution, a whole gallery of outstanding personalities whose names are forever etched in history appears before us. And what is remarkable is that many of these revolutionaries wore Masonic aprons long before they donned revolutionary cockades. Honoré Gabriel Riquetti, Count de Mirabeau, one of the greatest orators of his time, was initiated into Freemasonry in the Nine Sisters Lodge as early as 1780. His booming voice, initially heard in the silence of Masonic temples, later shook the walls of the National Assembly. It was Mirabeau who uttered the famous phrase in response to the royal order to disperse: "We are here by the will of the people and will leave only under the threat of bayonets." This courage, this defiance of authority, was cultivated for years in Masonic lodges, where he learned to speak freely, without fear of censorship. Georges Jacques Danton, this Jupiter of the Revolution, was also a Freemason. He was initiated into the Perfect Equality Lodge in Paris shortly before the revolutionary events. Danton's colossal energy, his organizational talent, and his ability to influence the masses were honed in Masonic discussions and rituals. At the critical moment of August 10, 1792, when the fate of the monarchy was being decided, it was Danton who coordinated the actions of the revolutionary sections of Paris, using management skills and connections acquired in the Masonic Brotherhood. Marquis de Lafayette, hero of two revolutions, American and French, was initiated into Freemasonry during his stay in America. Upon returning to France, he maintained close ties with Parisian lodges. In the early days of the Revolution, Lafayette was appointed commander of the National Guard, a new armed force designed to protect revolutionary gains. It is noteworthy that many officers of this guard were also Freemasons, which ensured unity of command and ideological solidarity. Emmanuel Joseph C.S., author of the famous pamphlet "What is the Third Estate?", which became the manifesto of the Revolution, was a member of several Masonic lodges. His ideas about popular sovereignty and the constitutional structure of the state were formed in Masonic discussions, where issues of a just social order were central themes. Even Maximilien Robespierre, the future leader of the Jacobins and ideologist of revolutionary terror, began his journey in the Masonic lodge Sincerity in his native Arras. There, he perfected his oratorical skills and developed the concept of a virtuous republic, which he later tried to put into practice. The Masonic ties of the revolutionaries were not limited to ideological influence. They served as a practical tool for organizing the revolutionary movement. In the early days of the Revolution, when official communication channels were controlled by the authorities, Masonic networks provided reliable transmission of information between Paris and the provinces. Couriers with Masonic passwords and signs freely passed through checkpoints and delivered important information and instructions. It is significant that many revolutionary committees were formed on the basis of existing Masonic lodges. Members of one lodge, already bound by ties of brotherhood and mutual trust, naturally became the core of local revolutionary organizations. In Bordeaux, Lyon, Marseille, Freemasons often led municipal revolutionary committees, using organizational experience gained in the lodges. Masonic influence was particularly evident in the work of the Constituent Assembly, where the first French Constitution was drafted. Many deputies were Freemasons and transferred the principles of Masonic organization to the state level. The idea of separation of powers, the election of officials, the equality of citizens before the law, all these concepts, which became the basis of the new state structure, had direct parallels in the organization of Masonic lodges. Even the ceremonial side of the revolution bore the imprint of Masonic rituals. Revolutionary festivals with their processions, symbolic actions, oaths at the altars of the fatherland resembled Masonic initiations. The Festival of Federation on July 14, 1790, when representatives of all departments of France gathered on the Champ de Mars in Paris to swear allegiance to the nation, the Constitution, and the King, was organized according to a Masonic scenario with symbolic purification of space, a procession, and a collective oath. It is noteworthy that many revolutionary symbols had Masonic origins. The Phrygian cap, which became a symbol of freedom, was used in Masonic rituals of higher degrees. The level and plumb line, tools of a stonemason and Masonic symbols of equality and justice, appeared on revolutionary emblems. Even the revolutionary calendar, with its new names of months and 10-day week, reflected the Masonic desire for a rational reorganization of the world. However, it would be an oversimplification to consider the French Revolution simply a Masonic conspiracy. Rather, Masonic lodges created an intellectual and organizational infrastructure that was used when a socio-economic crisis made revolution inevitable. Freemasons did not plan the overthrow of the monarchy as such. Many of them were moderate reformers who sought a constitutional monarchy of the English model. But when the revolutionary storm broke out, it was the Freemasons, with their organizational skills and networks of connections, who proved most prepared to lead and direct the movement. On the 14th of July, 1789, the Parisian crowd surged towards the ancient fortress of the Bastille. This was not a spontaneous impulse. Behind the apparent chaos lay clear organization. Leading the attackers were individuals, many of whom were bound by Masonic oaths. Pierre-Augustin Hulin, who commanded the assault on the fortress, was a member of the Three Brothers Lodge. Camille Desmoulins, who had called the people to arms 2 days earlier, belonged to the Nine Sisters Lodge. Even the Bastille's commandant, Delaunay, was part of the Masonic Brotherhood, which, however, did not save him from the mob's wrath. The fall of the Bastille, a symbolic stronghold of royal despotism, marked the revolution's first triumph. And this triumph was followed by a series of events where the Masonic trace is particularly distinct. When the Constituent Assembly adopted the quote in August of the same year, no fewer than 17 active Masons were among its authors. The text of the declaration strikingly echoed Masonic constitutions. Article 1, quote, seemed to have stepped right from the pages of Masonic catechisms. Masons played a key role in the work of the Constituent Assembly and then the Legislative Assembly. They constituted approximately 1/3 of the total number of deputies, but at the same time occupied a disproportionately large number of leadership positions. Of the 18 presidents of the Constituent Assembly, 12 were Masons. They chaired key committees, drafted decrees, and set the agenda. Masonic experience in self-governance proved invaluable in creating France's new administrative system. The division of the country into departments, the organization of municipal councils, the electoral system, all of this had prototypes in the structure of the Grand Orient, with its provincial lodges, elected positions, and system of representation. Masonic influence on the 1791 Constitution was particularly noticeable. This document, which transformed France into a constitutional monarchy, was imbued with Masonic ideas of the separation of powers, popular sovereignty, and civil liberties. Lawyer Adrien Duport, one of the main drafters of the Constitution, was a high-ranking Mason and a member of the influential Friends of Truth Lodge. It is noteworthy that in the early years of the Revolution, many Masons sought not the overthrow of the monarchy, but its reform. They saw the ideal in an English-style constitutional monarchy, where the king reigns but does not rule. This moderate stance reflected the consensus that existed in Masonic lodges, where nobles and bourgeois found common ground. However, the dynamics of the revolution gradually radicalized the Masonic movement. When King Louis XVI attempted to flee the country in June 1791 but was intercepted in Varennes, trust in the monarchy was irreparably undermined. Masons, who had previously advocated for a constitutional monarchy, began to lean towards republican ideas. During this period, the Masonic lodges of Paris underwent a significant transformation. Many of them effectively became political clubs. The Friends of Truth Lodge, founded in 1790, became one of the centers of Republican agitation. Its meetings were open to the public, and discussions concerned exclusively political issues. Here, the most radical calls for the establishment of a republic and the trial of the king were heard. By the summer of 1792, Republican sentiments had swept through a significant portion of the Masonic community. Many Masons actively participated in preparing the August 10th uprising, which led to the storming of the Tuileries Palace and the de facto overthrow of the monarchy. Georges Danton, one of the organizers of the uprising, coordinated the actions of the Parisian sections, many of which were headed by his lodge brothers. Notably, the Duke of Orleans, Grand Master of French Freemasonry, voted in the convention for the execution of his cousin Louis XVI, adopting the revolutionary name Philippe Égalité, equality. This gesture symbolized Freemasonry's definitive break with monarchical traditions. On September 21, 1792, the National Convention, where Masons constituted a significant faction, proclaimed the First French Republic. A day later, a new calendar was introduced, the first year of liberty. The Masonic dream of a new world order, based on reason and justice, seemed to be coming to fruition. In the following months, Masons actively participated in the creation of republican institutions. They developed projects for a new republican constitution, organized revolutionary tribunals, and formed the Committee of Public Safety. Masonic experience in organization and management proved to be in demand during the revolutionary crisis. Thus, from the storming of the Bastille to the proclamation of the Republic, the Masonic Brotherhood transitioned from a reformist movement to a revolutionary force. Masons not only prepared the ideological groundwork for the revolution, but also provided it with personnel, organizational structures, and communication networks. The overthrow of the monarchy became the culmination of this process, the embodiment of the Masonic dream of a new social order based on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. The revolution did not simply change France's political system. It created a new language of power, filled with symbols that spoke to the people without words. And many of these symbols had Masonic roots. When you look at revolutionary emblems, flags, and seals, you see a visual embodiment of Masonic philosophy, adapted for mass consumption. The level and the plumb rule, ancient stonemasons' tools, and important Masonic symbols appeared on revolutionary banners and official documents. The level symbolized the equality of all citizens, the plumb rule, the justice of the new laws. These symbols, used for centuries in secret rituals, were now openly displayed in the squares and streets of revolutionary Paris. Particularly indicative is the Phrygian cap, a red conical headgear that became a symbol of freedom and revolution. Few know that before appearing on the heads of the sans-culottes, it was used in rituals of higher Masonic degrees as a symbol of liberation from prejudice and dogma. In Masonic tradition, such a cap was worn by a newly initiated brother, symbolically freeing himself from the shackles of ignorance. In revolutionary France, it became the headgear of a free citizen who had cast off the shackles of tyranny. The revolutionary tricolor, the blue, white, and red flag that became France's national symbol, also has Masonic parallels. Blue and red are traditional colors of Scottish Freemasonry, and white symbolizes purity of intent. This color combination was used in the adornment of many French lodges long before the Revolution. When, on July 17, 1789, Mayor of Paris Jean-Sylvain Bailly, a prominent Freemason, presented Lafayette with a tricolor cockade, he was performing not merely a political, but a deeply symbolic act, understandable to his brethren in the lodge. Even the seal of the French Republic, depicting a woman with a bundle of rods, fasces, and a Phrygian cap, has Masonic origins. The fasces, an ancient Roman symbol of authority, was often used in Masonic symbolism as a sign of unity and strength of brotherhood. The female figure, an allegory of liberty, recalls the widow of Hiram Abiff from the central Masonic myth. Revolutionary festivals and ceremonies also bore a distinct imprint of Masonic rituals. The Festival of the Supreme Being, organized by Robespierre on July 14, 1794, was essentially an open-air Masonic ceremony. The altar of the fatherland, symbolic fires, processions with emblems of virtues, all these elements were well known to any Freemason. Robespierre himself, dressed in a blue suit and holding a bouquet of flowers and ears of corn, resembled the worshipful master of a lodge conducting a ritual. The revolutionary calendar, introduced in 1793, also reflected the Masonic aspiration for a rational restructuring of the world. A 10-day week, months named after natural phenomena, a new starting point for time, all this corresponded to the Masonic ideal of breaking with tradition and creating a new, more perfect order. It is noteworthy that many creators of the calendar, including the mathematician Gilbert Röhm, were Freemasons. Of particular interest is revolutionary rhetoric, the language of political speeches and decrees. Masonic terms and turns of phrase penetrated political discourse. The address brother and citizen replaced traditional titles. The concepts of enlightenment, light of reason, temple of liberty, all came from the Masonic lexicon. Even the famous revolutionary motto, liberty, equality, fraternity, had Masonic origins. In lodges, these values were proclaimed long before they appeared on the pediments of public buildings. Revolutionary France created its own civil religion, replacing traditional Catholicism. And this new religion, with its cult of reason and the supreme being, with civil holidays instead of church ones, with new saints and martyrs, was essentially a secularized version of the Masonic worldview. Revolutionary leaders, many of whom were Freemasons, transferred the esoteric practices of the lodges to the public sphere. Civil oaths, taken at the altar of the fatherland, resembled Masonic vows. The opening ceremony of the convention followed the structure of the opening of a Masonic lodge. Even the revolutionary tribunals, with their strict ritual and symbolic language, had parallels with Masonic courts of honor. Mass revolutionary festivals became a new form of collective ritual, uniting citizens into a single whole. The Festival of Federation on July 14, 1790, when hundreds of thousands of French people gathered on the Champ de Mars in Paris, was organized according to a Masonic scenario. The altar of the fatherland in the center of the field, a procession with symbolic objects, a collective oath. All these elements were familiar to any Freemason. Revolutionary architecture also experienced Masonic influence. Projects of public buildings developed during this period often included Masonic symbolism. The architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux, an active Freemason, created projects of ideal cities that embodied Masonic ideas about a harmonious society. His project of the saltworks at Arc-et-Senal represented the materialization of a Masonic temple, an ideal space for an ideal society. Even in the design of revolutionary banknotes and coins, Masonic influence can be traced. Assignats, paper money of revolutionary France, were adorned with Masonic symbols: the eye in a triangle, the compass in square, columns. These symbols, understandable to Freemasons, now became part of the daily life of all French people. Revolutionary France spoke a language of symbols, and this language was largely Masonic. The Brotherhood, which had developed its system of signs and rituals for centuries, provided the revolution with a ready symbolic arsenal. Masonic symbolism, adapted for mass consumption, became a powerful tool for shaping a new Republican consciousness. When the revolutionary wave receded, many Masonic symbols remained in the cultural code of France and all of Europe. The Phrygian cap still adorns the coat of arms of the French Republic. The motto, "Liberty, Equality, Fraternity," remains the national motto of France. The Masonic language of symbols, once secret and esoteric, became part of universal human heritage thanks to the French Revolution. Thus, Freemasonry not only paved the way for political changes, but also provided the revolution with the language of symbols necessary to form a new public consciousness. Revolutionary leaders, many of whom had been schooled in Masonic lodges, intuitively understood the power of symbols and rituals in managing mass consciousness. They used these tools to create a new civil religion capable of replacing traditional Catholicism and uniting the nation around Republican values. On January 21, 1793, Paris plunged into an uneasy silence. The streets leading to the Place de la Révolution were filled with a silent crowd. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a green carriage moved from the temple to the scaffold. Inside was a man who had recently been God's anointed, the absolute monarch of a great European power, Louis XVI, Citizen Capet, as he was now called. This execution became the culmination of the revolutionary process that had begun 4 years earlier, and many contemporaries wondered, was it not predetermined? Was it not part of a Masonic plan conceived long before the revolution? Masonic involvement in the king's trial was an undeniable fact. Among the 545 deputies of the convention who voted on the monarch's fate, no fewer than 120 were active Masons, and most of them voted for the death penalty without delay or right of appeal. Particularly telling was the behavior of Philippe Égalité, Duke of Orléans, Grand Master of French Freemasonry and the king's cousin. When it was his turn to vote, he ascended the tribune and, in a firm voice, declared, Many historians interpreted this moment as a symbolic act of Freemasonry's renunciation of the monarchical principle. The Grand Master, sending the king to his death, seemed to embody the Masonic idea of the supremacy of popular sovereignty over the divine right of monarchs. But there was also a more esoteric interpretation of these events. According to it, the execution of Louis XVI was an act of symbolic revenge for the destruction of the Knights Templar in the 14th century. The Templars, spiritual predecessors of the Masons, were crushed by the French king Philip the Fair, and their last Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned at the stake on March 18, 1314. Before his death, de Molay, according to legend, cursed the King of France and his lineage, predicting that the Capetians would soon die out, and Philip himself would die within a year. Surprisingly, the curse came true. Philip the Fair died 7 months after de Molay's execution, and the direct line of the Capetians ended with his sons. Many Masons of the 18th century believed that the spirit of the Templars lived on in their brotherhood, and considered it their duty to complete the retribution against the royal house. This theory was supported by a number of symbolic coincidences. Louis XVI was executed in the same square, then called Place Louis XV, where Jacques de Molay had been executed 4.5 centuries earlier. Before his death, the king, like the Templar, was forced to confess his, and finally, one witness to the execution allegedly exclaimed, a phrase that became part of Masonic legend. However, the most convincing argument for Masonic influence on the regicide is not legends, but documentary evidence of the preparation of the king's trial. The key figures in this process: Louis-Antoine Saint-Just, who delivered the indictment, Robert Lindet, who prepared the indictment, and Bertrand Barrère, who coordinated the proceedings, were all Masons. Saint-Just, in his famous speech against the king, used arguments clearly inspired by Masonic ideas of popular sovereignty. No one can reign innocently. Every king is a rebel and a usurper. This formulation reflected the Masonic view of power as a contract between the people and the ruler, which can be dissolved if the ruler violates his obligations. The procedure of the king's trial itself had a ritualized character, reminiscent of a Masonic quote. The sequence of speeches, the wording of questions, even the seating arrangement of participants in the hall, all had parallels with Masonic judicial rituals. But it would be an oversimplification to reduce the execution of Louis XVI solely to a Masonic vendetta. Deep political and ideological reasons lay behind it. Republicans saw the king as a symbol of the old order, which had to be destroyed to pave the way for a new society. The monarch's execution was not only a legal act, but also a symbolic one. It marked a definitive break with the past. Masonic ideology, with its critique of hereditary privileges and emphasis on personal merits, undoubtedly prepared the ground for such a radical step. For decades, lodges cultivated the idea that true nobility was determined not by birth, but by virtue and merit. This principle, when transferred to the political sphere, undermined the very foundations of monarchical power. It is significant that after the king's execution, the convention passed a decree abolishing the monarchy as an institution. France became a republic where supreme power belonged to the people. This fully corresponded to the Masonic ideal of a society based on a social contract, not on divine right. Masonic influence was also evident in how the execution itself was organized. It was carried out with a minimum of theatricality, almost prosaically. The king ascended the scaffold with dignity, was allowed to address the people, although his speech was interrupted by a drum roll, and then the guillotine quickly and, quote, ended his life. This approach reflected the Masonic ideal of rationality and rejection of cruel medieval executions. Many witnesses noted the strange calm of the crowd during the execution. There was no boisterous jubilation or overt expressions of sorrow, only a silent acceptance of a necessary but tragic act. This resembled the atmosphere of a Masonic lodge, where even the most dramatic rituals take place in an atmosphere of restrained dignity. After the king's execution, many Masonic lodges in Paris held special meetings dedicated to this event. They discussed not so much the political as the philosophical aspect of what had happened. The birth of a new society where power was based not on tradition and superstition, but on reason and the will of the people. The Jacobin Club and Masonic lodges, two revolutionary brotherhoods connected by invisible yet strong threads. When, in November 1789, a group of deputies from the Constituent Assembly founded the Society of Friends of the Constitution, later known as the Jacobin Club, few suspected that this organization would become the engine of the revolution's most radical phase. Notably, no less than half of the club's initial founders were active Masons. The resemblance between the Jacobin Club and Masonic lodges was striking to contemporaries. The club's structure, with its mother society in Paris and daughter branches in the provinces, almost exactly replicated the organizational model of the Grand Orient of France. As in Freemasonry, the Jacobins used a system of recommendations for admitting new members, practiced voting with black and white balls, and charged initiation fees and regular dues. even the Jacobin rituals had a Masonic flavor. New club members took a solemn oath reminiscent of the Masonic pledge. Meetings opened and closed according to a specific protocol. The club's president, like the worshipful master of a lodge, sat on a raised platform and managed the assembly with a special gavel. The Jacobins also adopted the principle of fraternal address from the Masons. Club members called each other brothers, and after the introduction of the Republican calendar, brothers and friends. This form of address, originating from Masonic lodges, became part of revolutionary culture and spread throughout society. However, it would be a mistake to consider the Jacobin Club merely a political continuation of Freemasonry. As the revolution radicalized, the relationship between these organizations became increasingly complex and contradictory. During the Jacobin dictatorship of 1793-1794, many Masons found themselves on different sides of the political barricades. Some brothers supported Robespierre's radical policies, others joined the moderate Girondins, and still others emigrated entirely, remaining loyal to the monarchy. Paradoxically, in the midst of the terror, many prominent Masons became its victims. Philippe Égalité, former Grand Master of French Freemasonry, was guillotined in November 1793. He was accused of conspiracy against the Republic, the very state in whose creation he had actively participated. Camille Desmoulins, a brilliant journalist and orator, a member of the Lodge, ascended the scaffold in April 1794 alongside his friend Danton. Their execution marked a new phase of the revolution, when the terror turned against its creators. Condorcet, a philosopher and mathematician, an active Mason, committed suicide in prison to escape the guillotine. Bailly, the first mayor of revolutionary Paris and a prominent Mason, was executed in November 1793. The list could go on. Dozens of high-ranking Masons perished at the hands of revolutionary justice. How to explain this paradox? Why did the revolution, largely prepared by Masons, begin to devour its creators? The answer lies in the fundamental contradiction between the Masonic ideal of a harmonious society based on enlightenment and gradual improvement, and the Jacobin concept of revolutionary violence as a tool for purifying society. Freemasonry, despite its critical attitude towards the old regime, remained a movement of elites. It sought reforms through the enlightenment of the upper classes, not through the mobilization of the popular masses. The Jacobins, on the other hand, relied on revolutionary violence and the support of the sans-culottes, urban artisans and workers. Robespierre, himself a former Mason, increasingly distanced himself from Masonic principles of tolerance and fraternal dialogue during his rule. His concept of a quote implied not merely political changes, but a complete moral regeneration of society, achieved, if necessary, through violence. In March 1794, the convention passed a decree on suspects, which effectively declared all those connected with secret societies enemies of the Republic. Although Freemasonry was not explicitly mentioned, many lodges took this as a signal to cease their activities. The Grand Orient of France virtually suspended its work during the Terror. Most Parisian lodges closed, and provincial ones significantly reduced their activity. Masons, who had recently been at the forefront of revolutionary changes, now tried not to draw attention to themselves. The irony of fate. An organization that for decades cultivated the ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity found itself under suspicion in an era when these ideals were proclaimed the official ideology of the state. Some historians see this as a natural result of Freemasonry's internal contradiction. A movement that sought to create a more just society, but remained elitist and closed, was inevitably bound to come into conflict with radical democracy of the Jacobin type. Other researchers emphasize the personal factor. Robespierre, Saint-Just, and other Jacobin leaders, even though they were Masons in the past, created a new revolutionary identity that superseded their former Masonic ties. Revolutionary fanaticism proved stronger than Masonic brotherhood. But despite all the contradictions, the influence of Freemasonry on the Jacobin Club and Jacobin ideology remained significant. Even while persecuting individual Masons, the Jacobins continued to use organizational models, rhetorical devices, and symbols borrowed from the Masonic tradition. After the Thermidorian reaction, on the 9th of Thermidor of the second year of the Republic, or July 27, 1794, according to the old calendar, France entered a new era. The fall of Robespierre and the Jacobin dictatorship marked not only the end of the Terror, but also the beginning of a profound transformation of the entire revolutionary movement, including Freemasonry. Masonic lodges, which had almost entirely ceased their activities at the height of Jacobin rule, began to gradually revive. Brothers who had been hiding from persecution or simply keeping a low profile once again gathered to perform rituals. However, this was no longer the Freemasonry that had existed before the Revolution. The Thermidorian regime, and subsequently the Directory that replaced it, treated Masonic organizations with cautious tolerance. The authorities understood that lodges could serve as a useful tool for stabilizing society and spreading moderate Republican values. At the same time, they feared that Masonic gatherings might become hotbeds of political opposition. The Grand Orient de France, which had practically disintegrated during the years of the Terror, began to rebuild its structures. In 1795, a new leadership was elected, consisting predominantly of supporters of moderate republicanism. Characteristically, there were almost no radicals among the new leaders of French Freemasonry. The Jacobin experience had taught the Brotherhood caution. During this period, Freemasonry underwent an important ideological transformation. If before the Revolution the lodges had been incubators of progressive ideas, now they became strongholds of stability and order. Masons who had survived the horrors of the Terror no longer sought radical changes. Their ideal became a republic based on constitutional order, respect for property, and civil liberties. The change in the social composition of the lodges is indicative. If in the pre-revolutionary period they were dominated by intellectuals, lawyers, and representatives of liberal professions, now merchants, bankers, and entrepreneurs. People interested in stability and economic prosperity increasingly occupied places. Freemasonry during the Directory era became increasingly bourgeois in character. In the provinces, the revival of Freemasonry was particularly active. In Bordeaux, Marseille, Lyon, cities severely affected by the Jacobin Terror, lodges became centers for uniting moderate Republicans and Royalists ready to accept a constitutional monarchy. Here, Masonic ties were used to restore shattered economic and social structures. However, a real turning point in the history of French Freemasonry occurred with the appearance of the young general Napoleon Bonaparte on the political scene. His rise to power, which began with the Italian campaign of 1796 and culminated in the coup d'état of the 18th of Brumaire, 1799, opened a new page in the history of the Masonic movement. The relationship between Napoleon and Freemasonry was complex and multifaceted. Bonaparte himself, it seems, was initiated into Freemasonry during the Egyptian expedition. Although no documentary evidence of his formal membership in a lodge has been preserved, many historical testimonies indicate his closeness to Masonic circles. More importantly, however, many of Napoleon's closest associates were active Masons. His brothers Joseph, Lucien, and Louis, Marshals Murat, Massena, Augereau, ministers Fouché and Talleyrand, all belonged to the Masonic Brotherhood. This created a special atmosphere in the entourage of the first consul, and then emperor, where Masonic connections often played no less a role than official hierarchy. Upon coming to power, Napoleon quickly realized the potential of Freemasonry as an instrument of state policy. Lodges could serve as a channel for spreading loyalty to the new regime, a means of integrating various social groups, and a mechanism for controlling the intellectual and political elite. Already in the first years of the consulate, the reorganization of French Freemasonry under the auspices of the state began. In 1804, the Supreme Council of France was created, uniting lodges of the Scottish Rite. It was headed by Jean-Jacques Régis de Cambacérès, the second consul, and later the Arch-Chancellor of the Empire and one of Napoleon's closest associates. Simultaneously, the Grand Orient de France was also being restructured in accordance with the new political realities. In 1805, Joseph Bonaparte, the emperor's brother, was elected its Grand Master. This appointment symbolized the new status of Freemasonry. From an independent brotherhood, it was transforming into a semi-official institution of the Napoleonic state. Under Napoleon, Freemasonry experienced unprecedented quantitative growth. If at the end of the Directory era there were about 300 lodges in France, by 1810 their number exceeded 1,200. State officials, army officers, representatives of the new imperial aristocracy, and intellectuals loyal to the regime became Masons. Freemasonry spread particularly actively in the army. Many regiments had their field lodges, which followed the army in all campaigns. Masonic rituals and fraternal ties strengthened the corporate spirit of the officer corps, creating additional bonds of loyalty between commanders and subordinates. Napoleon also used Freemasonry as an instrument of his imperial policy. As the French Empire expanded, lodges modeled on the French pattern were established in Italy, Germany, the Netherlands, and Poland. They became centers for spreading French influence and conduits for Napoleonic ideas and reforms. However, while encouraging the development of Freemasonry, Napoleon simultaneously sought to place it under strict state control. A system of police surveillance over lodges was introduced, all meetings had to receive prior authorization from the authorities, and membership lists were regularly submitted to the Ministry of Police. Masonic rituals and symbolism also underwent transformation in the spirit of imperial ideology. Elements of the cult of the emperor, glorification of his victories and reforms, increasingly occupied a place within them. Masonic medals and regalia were often adorned with imperial symbols: eagles, bees, laurel wreaths. This policy of state control over Freemasonry had dual consequences. On the one hand, it ensured the loyalty of most lodges to Napoleon's regime. On the other hand, it led to a certain degradation of Masonic ideals. The spirit of free search for truth, critical thinking, independence from power, all that constituted the essence of Freemasonry during the Enlightenment, was gradually replaced by conformism and the cult of the emperor's personality. Not all Masons accepted this transformation. In some lodges, the spirit of independence and sometimes opposition to the regime was preserved. This was especially characteristic of the southern regions of France, where Republican traditions were strong, and for the intellectual lodges of Paris, which remained faithful to the ideals of the Enlightenment. How to assess the true role of Freemasonry in revolutionary events? For more than 2 centuries, this question has divided historians, politicians, and public figures into opposing camps. Some see Masonic lodges as the architects of a grand conspiracy, while others deny any significant influence of the Brotherhood on the course of history. The truth, as is often the case, lies somewhere in the middle. The conspiratorial version of the Masonic plot took shape almost immediately after the revolutionary events. Its first serious exponent was Abbé Augustin Barruel, who published his Memoirs Illustrating the History of Jacobinism in 1797. Baruel argued that the revolution was the result of a meticulously planned conspiracy by Enlightenment philosophers, Freemasons, and Illuminati, who sought to destroy Christianity and monarchy throughout Europe. This line was continued by the Scottish scholar John Robison, who released his book Proofs of a Conspiracy Against All the Religions and Governments of Europe in the same year. According to his version, Freemasonry had been infiltrated by radical elements who transformed the brotherhood into a tool for undermining the traditional foundations of society. Both of these works laid the foundation for all subsequent conspiracy theories about the role of secret societies in world history. Their echoes are still heard today in discussions about a world Masonic government and a Masonic conspiracy. However, 20th century academic historiography generally rejected the idea of a Masonic conspiracy as a simplistic explanation for complex historical processes. Classic works on the history of the French Revolution, written by Albert Mathieu, Georges Lefebvre, and Albert Soboul, barely mention Freemasonry, focusing instead on socio-economic factors, class struggle, and the ideological currents of the era. In the mid-20th century, the pendulum swung in the other direction. Historians, seeking to distance themselves from conspiracy theories, began to downplay the role of Freemasonry in revolutionary events. The French researcher Daniel Mornay, in his work The Intellectual Origins of the French Revolution, acknowledged the existence of Masonic lodges, but denied their significant influence on the course of the revolution, considering them more as salons for social conversation than centers for preparing an overthrow. However, starting in the 1970s, thanks to the works of René Le Forestier, Pierre Chevalier, and especially Margaret Jacob, a serious academic study of Freemasonry's role in the intellectual and political life of the 18th century began. These researchers, relying on archival documents and employing rigorous methods of historical analysis, showed that Masonic lodges indeed played an important role in spreading Enlightenment ideas and shaping a new political culture. Modern historiography offers a more balanced view of the problem. Freemasonry is seen not as an omnipotent secret order pulling the strings of history, but also not as a harmless discussion club. It was an influential social movement that created a space for the formation of new ideas and practices that were subsequently utilized in the revolutionary process. Masonic lodges did not plan the revolution as such, but they created the intellectual and organizational infrastructure that was mobilized when socio-economic crisis made revolutionary changes inevitable. They were not the cause, but a catalyst for revolutionary processes. Particularly important is Freemasonry's contribution to the formation of a new political culture. Within the lodges, officials were elected, debates were held, and votes were cast, all of which later became the norm of political life. Freemasonry created a model of civil society long before this concept entered the political lexicon. Freemasonry's contribution to the spread of Enlightenment ideas was also significant. Lodges served as channels of communication through which new philosophical concepts spread from intellectual centers to the provinces, from the elite to broader segments of educated society. Finally, one cannot underestimate the role of Masonic networks in the organizational support of the revolutionary movement. Personal connections established in the lodges, trust between brothers, skills of collective action. All of this was utilized when the active phase of the revolution began. A balanced approach to assessing Freemasonry's role in the revolution requires considering the limitations of Masonic influence. Freemasonry was not a monolithic movement. Various currents and factions existed within it. Many Masons remained loyal to the monarchy and the church even during the height of the revolutionary events. Others, on the contrary, evolved towards radical republicanism. Furthermore, Freemasonry was only one of many factors that determined the course of the revolution. The economic crisis, social contradictions, the intellectual currents of the Enlightenment, the international situation. All these elements intertwined into a complex knot of causes and effects that led to the fall of the old regime. The history of Freemasonry and the French Revolution reminds us of the complexity of historical processes, which cannot be reduced to simple schemes of conspiracy or accidental circumstances. It also warns against ideologized interpretations of the past that subordinate historical truth to the political interests of the present. The legacy of the French Revolution continues to live on in the Masonic tradition, even after more than 2 centuries. The union of Freemasonry and the revolutionary movement did not merely change the political map of Europe, it transformed the very essence of Masonic doctrine, giving it new meaning and direction. After the fall of Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna in 1815, Freemasonry found itself at a crossroads. During the Restoration era, many European monarchs viewed the lodges as a potential source of subversive activity. Austrian Chancellor Metternich called Masons a revolutionary hydra whose heads grow back again. In Russia, Emperor Alexander I, who initially favored Freemasonry, banned it in 1822. Similar prohibitions were introduced in Spain, Portugal, and the Italian states. However, French Freemasonry, having survived the revolutionary storm, managed to adapt to new conditions. The Grand Orient of France, which resumed its activities after the Bourbon Restoration, became a refuge for the liberal opposition. Its lodges gathered former Napoleonic officers, Republicans, Constitutionalists, all those who nostalgically recalled revolutionary ideals and opposed the revival of absolutism. It was during this period that a crucial ideological division occurred in world Freemasonry. While Anglo-Saxon lodges remained faithful to traditional principles, including belief in the great architect of the universe and political neutrality, French Freemasonry increasingly leaned towards secularism and political activism. This split, which began in the first half of the 19th century, culminated in 1877, when the Grand Orient of France officially excluded the requirement of belief in a supreme being from its statutes, proclaiming the principle of absolute freedom of conscience. This decision led to a break in relations with Anglo-American Freemasonry and the creation of 2 parallel Masonic traditions that still exist today. The revolutionary legacy was also manifested in the active participation of Masons in 19th-century political movements. The Carbonari in Italy, the Decembrists in Russia, participants in the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 in France. All of them were, to one degree or another, connected with Masonic lodges. Freemasonry became a kind of incubator for revolutionary and liberal ideas, preserving and developing the legacy of 1789. This was particularly evident during the Revolution of 1848, when Masons actively participated in the creation of the Second French Republic. The provisional government, formed after the overthrow of Louis Philippe, included several high-ranking Masons, among them Alphonse de Lamartine and Alexandre Ledru-Rollin. During this period, Masonic lodges in Paris openly demonstrated their support for the Republican government, holding public ceremonies with Republican symbolism. During the Paris Commune of 1871, Masons also proved to be an active political force. On April 26, 1871, over 1,000 Parisian Masons of various rites marched in a procession from the City Hall to the Place de la Bastille, demonstrating their solidarity with the communards. They hoisted Masonic banners on the city fortifications, symbolically placing themselves between government troops and the defenders of the Commune. Although this gesture could not prevent the bloody massacre of the Communards, it showed that a significant part of French Freemasonry remained faithful to revolutionary ideals even 80 years after the storming of the Bastille. In the era of the Third Republic, from 1870 to 1940, French Freemasonry reached the peak of its political influence. Many leading politicians, from Léon Gambetta to Émile Combes, were Masons and implemented ideas stemming from the Revolutionary era. The separation of church and state, universal education, social reforms. Masonic lodges became an important element of the Republican infrastructure, ensuring communication between political elites and civil society. The role of Freemasonry in the anti-clerical campaign of the early 20th century, which culminated in the 1905 law on the separation of church and state, was particularly notable. This law, developed with the active participation of Masons, brought to life one of the key ideas of the Revolutionary era, the principle of a secular state. In the 20th century, Freemasonry continued to preserve and develop the revolutionary legacy, adapting it to new historical conditions. During World War II, many French Masons participated in the resistance, seeing in Nazism and the Vichy regime a denial of all the ideals of 1789. After the war, Freemasonry actively supported the processes of European integration, decolonization, and the expansion of civil rights, all that can be seen as a continuation and development of the revolutionary principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Today, in the 21st century, Freemasonry in France and the world continues to bear the imprint of its revolutionary past. The Grand Orient of France, the largest Masonic organization in the country, openly positions itself as a progressive organization advocating the ideals of secular humanism, social justice, and democracy. Its official documents and the speeches of its leaders constantly refer to the revolutionary legacy and its modern significance. Thus, the alliance of Freemasonry and the revolutionary movement, born in the 18th century, continues to influence contemporary political culture. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, forged in Masonic lodges and tempered in the fire of revolution, have become an integral part of the modern democratic tradition. The revolution changed Freemasonry, giving it a more politicized and progressive character. In turn, Freemasonry preserved and developed revolutionary ideals, securing them a place in the intellectual and political landscape of subsequent eras. This symbiosis of Masonic tradition and revolutionary legacy remains one of the most interesting and significant phenomena in the history of modern political thought. It reminds us that great historical events do not remain in the past. They continue to live and evolve, taking new forms and adapting to new conditions. The revolutionary flame ignited in the Masonic lodges of the 18th century continues to illuminate the path to a more just and free society, dreamed of by the philosophers of the Enlightenment and the revolutionaries of 1789.